Yes, hello, Year 12, 2018. It's time to start thinking about some Module A texts and our comparative study of text, which is Metropolis in 1984. The key to Metropolis in 1984, of course, in Module A, and the comparative study is in that word comparative. And really what we're looking at is a comparison of context. Not necessarily of style, because we're looking at a film and a novel, and it goes without saying that when you start writing the essay, of course, you're deconstructing the novel in terms of its quality as a novel, what it does with language, what it does with the way it shapes itself, it orders itself, the text within the text, the Goldstein narrative, as well as the Winston Smith narrative of 1984, and of course the obvious one, Metropolis, the film. We're pulling it apart as a work of cinema and as a silent work and so forth, which is kind of important. So I'm out the back here, so these dogs. Here we go. Oh, there goes one. There goes the other one. So context. Now, the context is not too far away with both authors in this particular module. We're dealing with Fritz Lang, who comes to us from Weimar, Germany, W-E-I-M-A-R, Germany, the Weimar Republic. There were two of them, and this is in between the two world wars. So this is a Germany that is completely, not necessarily decimated, it's probably worse than that. It's lost its government, it has lost its king, its Kaiser, Wilhelm II. That whole world has been blown away. And a promise of a great, forward, brilliant Germany seems to have been lost, because Germany was becoming, at the turn of the century, a superpower, and this is one of the reasons why it's ended up in war with the British Empire, which is odd because they're kind of linked through their families too. It works in that sense that it's sort of, a lot of people feel it's lost its way, and so you get two things going on in Weimar Germany. You've got the rise, the very slow at first rise of the returned soldier group, which kind of leads to the Nazi Party. The first pushes of Hitler and so forth were about 1920, and it wasn't until the mid-1930s where he really was able to grab any type of power. And you've also got a very strong left wing. You've got a very strong socialist kind of idea. I don't even the Nazis used the word socialism, but we're talking about left wing as opposed to fascism. And that is going on, and a bit of research into that is a good thing. The image I've got there is an image of children playing with a stack of money, and this is the German mark, and you can see there how much money these children have to play with. Now, if you're thinking about a nation's currency being used in play money by that volume, it shows you the value of the mark. The marks become affected by such bad inflation, they call it hyperinflation, that its value goes from one mark is costs one mark to buy a loaf of bread, to that afternoon to 30 million marks to buy a loaf of bread. So the currency becomes useless, and the reason for that, you can ask those who study World War I and modern history, is the way in which Europe was dealing with the Germans, the reparations, the loss of their industrial centre in the Rhineland, and all sorts of other things that kind of contract into this very failed state that the first Weimar was. The second Weimar was actually quite strong, but the first one, quite a failed state. And so this is its context, and a really good interrogation of that would be interesting. The other thing we're dealing with as well is the birth of cinema in itself. In the 1920s, cinema's been around for about 1 to 2 decades, and cinema, of course, is an image-laden thing because there's no sound. And so the great Russians like Sergei Eisenstein and people like that have developed the first real way of making cinema work, the idea of montage, of image working over a title screen and so forth like that. So we'll go into some of those ideas as well as to how cinema is really in its birth, and the birth of science fiction and speculative fiction, which was going on with H.G. Wells and War of the Worlds and things like that. And in Germany, of course, this leads to an idea of what speculative fiction about what mechanisation might mean. And this was also happening in the West. Charlie Chaplin had a film called Modern Times, which very much reflects the Metropolis imagery, but with a comic sensibility, given that it's Chaplin. So we'll talk about that as well. And it's a very important thing to consider, that we do not disregard the context, because context is key. The other thing, of course, is the theatrical ideal of Bertolt Brecht, or expressionistic epic work, which is to make art much more didactic. And that is, it is there to actually teach a lesson, teach a moral lesson, and have an allegorical sense, as opposed to presenting the real. Because if you present the real, it's an impossibility, because the real is far too gruesome and far too brutal, and to them far too boring to put on stage. So you might as well present things in a heightened sense. And we'll talk about Brechtianism as well, which sort of gives us a sense of what's going on in Metropolis, as well as the idea that mankind has sort of come to a point where they realise if you get such massive warfare on an industrial scale, then mechanisation and industrialisation means basically the end of the human race as we know it. And there's a great fear going on in there. And this is reflected in the poetry of Wolf Lowen, right through to this sort of mechanised stuff, and then ends up with plays like Wait for Godot and so forth. We then have post-war Britain. Now that's an image of, see there it's come up, post-war Britain. You can see Britain was actually quite decimated. And again, there's that word decimated. It's not really a great word, because that means 1 in 10 are removed. It's a Roman sort of occupancy idea that it shows that if you arbitrarily destroy 1 in every 10 soldiers, then connections and soldiery doesn't matter, and so therefore true power lies within the one who's doing the decimating. I digress. This image here, of course, shows you the London after Germans bombing it and destroying it, and a London that was razed to the ground, essentially, in some serious ways. If you go to London, you can still see remnants of the bomb blasts on a lot of the buildings, and it was very dire. And a lot of our children's stories, as you know, like things like The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, deal with children going into the countryside and staying with distant relatives and so forth, which you may be familiar. Even there's remnants of that even in Harry Potter. You get an orphan child sort of living with an uncle who doesn't treat them properly and things like that, and then he's taken away to some magical, mystical land. This is an English motif that's been around for 50 or 60 years, because this image here, you can imagine that if you had children, you'd want to get them as far away from that as possible. So the children were taken out of London and sent to areas that were much safer when the war was on. So post-war Britain was a very broken, dangerous place, and a place therefore for political extremism to become the reality. And over on the Russian side of things, you've got Stalinism and the birth of the Stalinist ideals and complete and utter socialism. They've just seen what fascism can do. And so these big models of political ideology are creeping in. And so Orwell naturally sees this as something that's potentially going to take on the truth in London. And so you get this idea of London becoming Airstrip 1 because it's lost its identity, it's lost what it is that made it London. You can see in that image that the London that we know is not there, it's a shell. And so anything could come out of that particular world. Knowing full well that Orwell's great work is published in 1948, which is still very much post-war Britain. You look at the Australian cricket tour of 1948, and they're called the Invincibles. Well, they're taking on a country that just went through that. So anyway, I hope you've been reading 84, and I hope you've been considering or finding a copy of Metropolis and seeing how you go. Good luck with the Frost essay and everything. Glad to see some people are contacting me over that, and we'll be back into it soon. Enjoy.